Hello, everybody. Welcome to Collecting the Beatles and Authentic Radio. And we're with Robert Rodriguez. And Robert, author, podcaster, disc jockey.
That's true. My passion job.
Yeah. And we're talking about Robert's now book called Revolver, because Revolver is coming out here shortly, how the Beatles reimagined rock and roll. Now, Robert, I know the book is 10 years old now, but it's still up to date. The facts are still there. I haven't really found anything that I would go back and say, oh, he was wrong there as far as, what's come of light of late. But why Revolver? Why did you decide to write a book on Revolver?
Because I thought that it's something that when I started formulating the idea for it, that Pepper got all the glory basically as not only one of the greatest rock albums of all time, but a lot of people who were what you would call influencers now deemed it as their most important album. And as a longtime fan, I beg to differ. I was more like what about, this is what set the table for Pepper. And really, if you want to get down to the nitty gritty of the making, this is not, you don't have to tear down Pepper to boost Revolver, which is what some people accuse me of doing. And, I only have so much editorial control over what's in that book. I turn in my manuscript, but they slice and dice it as they like.
Right.
But in any event, I thought that the case was there that with Revolver, it's really a kind of a high watermark of four-way cooperation in that band, where you have the four-headed monster, all of them still pulling in the same direction and contributing freely to each other's material, even if they didn't write it. With Pepper, you see a lot more disengagement. You see, certainly Harrison is kind of checked out. His head is in India at that point.
Yep.
Ringo talks about, well, I learned how to play chess. John is enthralled to acid for a lot of that time. And Paul is really driving their artistic engine. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, Superior Beatles is where you've got them all four fully engaged and not this sort of, confluence of the four personalities to varying degrees. You can try to quantify the art as far as, well, what about Day in the Life is like, isn't that one of their greatest songs? Well, yeah, it is. And that was a moment. But overall, I thought that Pepper was, I'm seeing it more and more as my thinking evolves as almost a theatrical thing, as almost a theatrical side project,
yes,
a one-off, all about the presentation, rather than a successor to the line of albums they'd done to that point. Even Ringo himself said, because they didn't count Magical Mystery Tour as an album, that was a film score to a made-for-TV film. They didn't see that as like the successor to Pepper or anything else. But Ringo had said, I see the White Album as us picking up a Revolver left off. That's the natural sequence of things. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, he's really drilling down to the way I saw it, which is it's the next rock album after Revolver. But with their headspace in Revolver coming not that long after the creation and release of Rubber Soul, they had so advanced in their thinking. And if you look at the stuff that's not music making going on around them in early '66, George gets married, and then they're supposed to be making the third film for UA, and they couldn't agree on a script, so suddenly they've got all this extra time. Hey, let's use it to experiment. They've been moving in that direction really since they recorded Yesterday for Help. That was an experiment. Paul solo with a string section. Lo and behold, it goes to #1 in America. They didn't want it out in Britain as a single because they were afraid that it was too radical a change. This is not
right.
the Beatles sound. Once they saw, hey, we had success with this, you see it to start creeping into the making of Rubber Soul. Let's put sitar on here. Let's do wind up piano on In My Life. Let's just add all these embellishments that are purely studio craft that we can't pull off live. And it gets accepted and loved and all that. So then they're like, okay, fine. That's all the validation they need. Going to Revolver, we're going to go full tilt. And the first song they track was the last one written before the session started, Tomorrow Never Knows. Mm-hmm. This is us throwing away the rule book and everything we know about how to make records.
And that's the same time that John had said, I want my voice to sound like 100 Dalai Lamas or chanting right. or something, 100 monks
10,000 Tibetan monks,
yeah.
Which must have been, I don't know if Michael Lindsay Hogg was privy to that thought, but when he's talking about 2,000 torch-lit Arabs, it's not too far off the mark. It's kind of in the same stream there. But that is another track that really, if you want to support my thesis of the four-way collaborative, there you've got a track that John comes in with. He just wrote it, having read the Psychedelic Experience by Timothy Leary that he picked up at Indica Gallery bookstore. like the week before. He gets through it, pulls a few key lines out of there. It's essentially, he goes in there standing before George Martin, strumming away earnestly on his acoustic guitar. It's essentially a one chord song.
Right.
And then that's when they all bring their contributions in. Ringo, that unbelievable drum pattern that's not a tape loop but sounds like one, just this rock solid foundation, sounding nothing like anything he played before. George brings in the tambura, the Indian droning instrument, to give it that atmosphere. Suddenly, Indian sounds and LSD would be inseparable. That point going forward.
That's true. That's
much to Robbie's chagrin.
And Paul brings in the tape loops.
The tape loops, yes, exactly. So they're all contributing and making this thing so much greater than the sum of its parts. That, and you can point to other examples too. Eleanor Rigby, where it's Paul's baby initially, but then he tossed it out to everybody who's in the room to contribute lyrically, and it just makes this thing so much bigger. Taxman, George comes in with it. Great drumming from Ringo once again. Ask John, he gets stuck for a couple lines. John comes up with a great line about declaring pennies on your eyes, and Paul's Indian sounding lead guitar. Man. Phenomenal.
It's one of my favorite songs of theirs.
Absolutely. And it's so fresh. You know, it could have been recorded in the punk era or the 90s or today.
Well, I'm sure it influenced a lot of the later bands. So
oh, sure. And you look at that whole Britpop scene in the like circa 1995. It's like straight out of Beatles 66. Unbelievable, even to the physical dress and the glasses. And it's 100%. So it seems like, you know, my book came out in 2012, but the process of rediscovering Revolver, because in America it was short the 3 John Lennon songs that they'd siphoned off for Yesterday and Today. So it's got 3 George songs, but only 2 John authored songs on the album, which is weird. But the CD era commences 1988. They start putting out the British configurations worldwide. So that helps when people get to hear what the Beatles' original vision was for that album. But I think that you'd had now a generation removed from the Beatles put those albums out, and the sensibilities of the listeners are advancing that much more. They're ready for something that is such an incredibly diverse collection of songs. You know, if you want to call Revolver in any way a concept album, the concept could be every song sounds completely different than the song that comes before. It's like each one is almost a genre unto itself. And so that kind of diversity, which you wouldn't see again until the White Album, is its strong suit. And the amazing thing is it clocks in at what, 30 minutes or something?
Short.
Most of the songs are like 2 minutes tops, or a little bit in 2 minutes and change. Unbelievable. It's all right to the point, just razor sharp. So it packs a punch, and it is so modern in sensibility. There's nothing dated or beat group about it.
Arguably,
no filler.
No filler, none at all.
And arguably, I mean, to me, I hear just part of now Power Pop was there before, but in the guitars of Andrew Bird Can Sing. I mean,
the twin harmony leads.
It just gives me
it gave
chills.
Boston her career.
It just gives me. But what we were talking about earlier, as a group effort, I think that comes through with Revolver too.
Totally.
Just exactly, just to paraphrase what you were saying, it's a group effort. They're working together. This isn't Paul's song. I mean, it's our song. We're still the Beatles.
Right. We're the Beatles writ large. And the thing is, they're sort of casting the songs too in a way that, you know, maybe before, like you listen to the session tape of Yesterday and George is audible on the tape, and, you know, they're thinking of a group arrangement from the get-go. And that was the first sort of indication, well, maybe not everything has to be a group effort. And they really expand on that by the time they get to Revolver. It's like, well, I guess all we need really is Paul and Ringo on this one. You like For No One, something like that. It's like whatever suits the song is what makes it there. A song like Got to Get You Into My Life, I think John doesn't even play on it, but he's probably, you know, banging a tambourine or something.
In the
like
studio,
that.
yes. Yeah, even if it was like a Paul and Ringo song, the others were in the studio from what I can gather.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, that the rap on the White Album, that, that's the, you know, the me in a backing band, Paul in a backing band, George in a backing band. It's total bullshit, because even songs that emerged as solo, you know, like a Blackbird or Mother Nature's Son, listen to the session tapes. There's John in the producer's booth. I think a Nilsson brass band would sound good here, Paul.
Yeah.
Or Julia, you know, Paul's encouraging him. Unbelievable. So that band dynamic is still there. You know, forget what came out of Lennon's mouth and Lennon Remembers or any of the myth that goes on.
Well, that's just to create drama for things.
Totally.
Well, that's that's John. That's just, you know,
he speaks
says
in
one
headlines.
thing 1 minute. And yeah. Another thing I want to touch on though is you highlight in the book a little bit of Jeff Emmerich's work. Now Jeff can be controversial. Craig and I met him, nice guy. Wish would have had a chance to interview him.
Yeah.
But he did do some valid work as far as kind of pushing some of the studio things at EMI. Would you agree with that statement,
Absolutely.
Robert?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read his book, he did the lion's share of the
that's right. He even wrote the songs.
Right. Yeah. George Martin just sat behind the desk and watched. But, yeah. But no, absolutely. And I think that is not to take anything away from Norman Smith, who was the guy he replaced. I think there was a way that Emmerich was trying to frame it. It's like suddenly when I came on board, I'm the young guy and I'm not bound by the rules. Suddenly anything goes. Well, where did Norman Smith go after he left the Beatles? He produced the first Pink Floyd album.
Yeah.
I don't think he was that conservative, folks.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And Revolver. Revolver, I think if I may be mistaken here, but the Beatles, it was out when they were touring and they did even play a song on that 66 tour off Revolver.
Who does that?
Yeah.
The very week the album drops, it was August 5th and then August 8th between the UK and the US. And they played their first concert August 12th on the final North American tour. And as if it didn't exist. The newest song they did play on stage, which was recorded during the sessions, was Paperback Writer, but it's not on Revolver. So, on the one hand, you could say, well, maybe some of that would have been too hard to translate to the stage. And of course, anybody can do any of that stuff now,
Right.
but there's so many guitar songs they could have done. They could have done a She Said, and Andrew Bird Can Sing. I'm Only Sleeping, maybe. There's all kinds of things they could have done. They could have done Rain. What I think it really shows is that they definitely saw themselves as wearing two different hats. One is the performing band, where we're basically our own tribute act, performing the hits. And the other is Where Their Heart Lie, which is the studio band. This is what gets us excited. We're going into uncharted territory here. And
Yeah.
This is fun to us. And why wreck it by doing a half-assed version before 3,000 people aren't listening anyway?
And Robert, now when you were writing the book, when you were doing your research, first of all, it is immaculately researched. I mean, just in depth, and you've crossed your I's and dotted your T's. Where did you start? I mean, how did you even know where to start? Did you have some of this, some of the paper, some of the information already, or what's the process you started the book? Oh, I want to do Revolver. How did you get started?
So the process for me is that anything that I do in terms of research for anything, whether it was the Beatle books I did that preceded that, or stuff I've done since, or stuff for the podcast, is I don't want to rely so much on, well, what did they think about it 10 years later, 30 years later, whatever. What were they saying about it then? And what was going on in the world? Which is why at the back of that book, I put a timeline of 1966 showing, these guys were living and operating in the world where, Donovan was recording and Lovin' Spoonful and the Byrds and all that stuff. So they're listening. I mean, the thing that we know, one more thing that if you're hardcore and do the research, this about the Beatles already. But when you watch Get Back, it might have been revelatory to other people when Paul and Linda are singing Build Me Up Buttercup.
Yes.
They pay total attention to the charts and what other people are doing all the time. They're commenting on, rather disdainfully, on Marmalade's cover of Obla Di Obla Da, things like that. So they knew what was happening. And that's the kind of thing that really informs their work, is that they're not creating in a vacuum. They're absorbing and pulling. Classic example on Revolver is Good Day Sunshine, which was cribbed, at least inspiration-wise, from Daydream by Lovin'
Spoonful. Yeah.
It got that nice sort of vibe to it, that sunshiny. And then Paul takes it a different direction, of course. But it's that kind of thing where you can, if you dig deep enough, you can see, well, this was obviously they were listening to this record at this time. A lot of people point to Here, There, and Everywhere as well, obviously Beach Boys. And, in fact, Pet Sounds came out halfway through the making of Revolver. They did get to listen to it at premiere. Here and There and Everywhere was recorded after it. I don't think anybody can prove decisively that, well, yes, that song didn't exist until they listened to Pet Sounds. I think they had it in their minds anyway. Yeah. And if anything, it sounds like In My Room, if you're going to point to anything, Beach Boys is a sound. But I think, though, it encouraged them overall. It's like, you know what? Thematic unity. That's an idea we can run with next go round.
Right.
So as far as the material in the book, do you have any of this actual, like the promo posters in the book? It's illustrated with all kinds of great illustrations, like the Music Maker. You've got in N-N-E.
Yeah. And that's the thing. You were asking me before how I researched it. So I go straight to 1966. I go to whatever trade publications I get my hands on, ephemeral stuff. People ask me, since I've been doing Beatles stuff, it's like, do you collect? What do you collect? And they assume that I've got like a house full of 10,000, Beatle records, things like that.
Like
I've got
Troy
a lot
does.
of vinyl, but I'm not a Troy Hubbard. Believe me. I'm not even in his league. I haven't played the same sport. What I collect is paper. And the Beatles were such great interviewees. And through years of like the BBC stuff coming out, I don't mean the official, I mean the unofficial, where there's tons of talking about their latest record and what they think they're doing. They gave press conferences every city when they're on tour. So you've got that. You've got tons of print interviews they did, NME, Melody Maker, Disc, whenever they talk to American press. So there's a great body of work. If you want to know what the Beatles were thinking when they were creating and before the myth set in and, they took their cues from what critics were saying. And then they, Paul will say whatever he says about, well, this is obviously us. Blah, blah, blah. No, when it's new and exciting and they don't know what the outcome's going to be, that's the stuff it's like gold to me, because that takes you closer to what was in their heads as they're rolling tape on these new ideas.
There's on something about the Beatles, Robert's show that he hosts. You have a historian that is just amazing, that really gives some great insight. Would you, Robert, give a plug out real fast? Give a plug to I
Aaron
forgot
Weber?
her name.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. Yes, sorry, Aaron.
Yeah, Aaron Weber. So she was a Beatle fan, and I have to say, for as great as her book is, I was floored when I found out how young she was. It's like, holy smoke. She makes us
Damn
feel like-
puppies.
Yeah, right. No, she was born actually not in John Lennon's lifetime, if you can believe that.
Yeah.
But she went to school and became a historian, and for her PhD, I believe, actually, no, she doesn't have a PhD yet, but for a thesis paper, she wanted to, as a big Beatle fan, as well as a historian and a history major, sort of apply historiological method to the Beatle books that have come out, both the memoirs and books written by authors like, say, a Nicholas Schaffner, and examine them and see if they stand up. And that's something I don't think anybody had ever applied before. It's one thing to apply historiography to a book on World War II. It's something else to do it about a pop culture artifact. And the Beatles are truly history now. They're not just a group that was popular a long time ago. So is Herman's Hermits, but no one's doing deep research on them.
Right.
You enjoy them if you do, but there's not a clamor to go through their session tapes or their film outtakes or anything like that. So the Beatles are part of history. They influenced culture beyond words. So she went through the catalog, the literary canon, books like Philip Norman's Shout, Hunter Davies' authorized biography, as well as memoirs by key players, including your Mr. Emmerich and other people, The Love You Make, Peter Brown, and basically did this book called The Beatles and the Historians that analyzed whether these books were worth the paper they're printed on, basically, is to boil it down to its essence. And what she came up with was a lot of things that might have been taken seriously because they came from a serious author or journalist. They so lack any solid ground foundation.
No substantiation at all.
It's like they're basically expanding on press releases, And if you want to point to the greatest criminal in terms of Beatle history being an influencer, it's the Lennon Remembers interview. That was John spouting off, and he knew by the next day, well, okay, run your little interview in your magazine, but I don't want this out as a book. What does John Lennon do? He puts it out as a book. He's thinking in terms of, I'm a publisher. This is friggin' gold. You are endlessly quotable. This is shocking. It's emotional. It's dramatic. I could sell this by the ton to every Beatle fan.
Whether it's true or not.
Exactly.
Right.
And he knew damn well. And you know how you know that? It's because he's not a journalist.
Yeah.
He follow-up question, what's that? No. Where John's, contradicting himself from one page to another. He's just like fanboy transcribing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then you have all these authors that use that as like, oh, well, if John said it, it must be true, as the foundation for their own books. So Aaron goes after, Philip Norman being the most high profile criminal in terms of putting out something that's not worth anything, because number one, he's such a Lennon fanboy himself. He's the one that, when promoting Shout, went on TV and said, well, John Lennon was 3/4 of the Beatles.
Yeah.
And, there's other people to varying degrees. Ray Coleman, who was a journalist, knew the Beatles, was friends with John. He did a Lennon biography that, by Aaron's analysis, you know what? He's just taking stuff verbatim. He's not analyzing. He's not double checking. He's not looking at the context of when this was said or who said it, any of that stuff. This is all historiological method that you want to get to the truth about something. You want to make this a worthwhile read, then there's certain rules you got to follow.
And standards. Yeah. Certain standards you have to, ethics, and, you have to follow. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, if you're not really interested in the truth, you just want to put out there something that resonates with the way you're inclined to feel. Well, those books are a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah. Now, Robert, did Aaron turn her sights onto the Revolver book?
She wouldn't dare. No, mostly it was the stuff that was either the Philip Norman Shout, Albert Goldman's The Lives of John Lennon, which is a book that a lot of fans have hated on from day one. Come to find out, his research is impeccable.
His research is good.
Stuff. Yeah. Now that is not to say the book is not deeply flawed, because
his narrative is not. I would say his narrative.
If he could find a way to spin something negatively, absolutely would. There's any number of errors of fact in there that rest solely with him. But he had a platoon of people out there doing the interviews for him. How he chose to spit it, that's all on him.
Right.
But the research itself is rock solid. It's all at Columbia University in New York right now. Lewison's been relying on it, because the one thing to say about Goldman is that he was savvy enough to go after people nobody had talked to before.
Yes.
Got a ton of history on Yoko in Japan, pre-Lennon, spoke to people in Germany, people in Liverpool, all these people that were still, not elderly, that were like middle-aged and still had fresh memories that nobody had bothered to talk to before, and got all this stuff down. So for that body of research is invaluable. And that's the way to do it. Again, with me, I talked to a few people, but mostly I relied on the Beatles themselves, their contemporary interviews before and during the making of Revolver, when I wrote that book, is because I want to know what they thought they were doing.
Were there stories during that time more consistent? I mean,
oh yeah,
that later on they may have changed or embellished things, but at the time they were.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's funny that just something non-Revolver to illustrate that is, the myth that still persists today that drives me nuts is that Stuart Sutcliffe was such a terrible bass player. How terrible was he? He was so terrible, he played with his back to the audience, so they couldn't look at his fretting fingers. As if the first thing that's going to tell you somebody is inept is your eyes and not your ears, right? Yeah. So we know from the most reliable accounts that not only was he competent, he was no Paul McCartney, but he didn't need to be. They were playing basic rock and roll. He was perfectly suited to that. When they're playing very basic music. In fact, he sat in with other bands in Hamburg and gave Klaus his first lessons on bass. But you've got a 1964 interview with Paul where he's talking about, and Stewart, he wasn't much of a rock star, but he can handle himself on bass. He was okay. Something like that. He's positive.
Yeah.
Fast forward decades later, and he starts repeating the whole, he was terrible. He was really our weak link, but he was John's friend, and he'd play with his back to the audience. So you wonder, where's that coming from? What happened in between there?
Right.
What happened in between there was Alan Williams' book, The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, where he is the first guy to make that assertion. Don't mistake Alan Williams for a historian. He's a raconteur.
It's a fun read, everybody. It's a fun read.
Absolutely. That's the one they should be making into a movie, because it's so laugh out loud funny. But don't mistake it for history, folks.
Right.
It's hilarious. He was there, yes, but he's a storyteller, and he does not let the facts get in the way of a good story. So the reason he said that, besides the fact that he's trying to make this point that, well, the only reason Stewart was in the band was because he was John's friend. Well, that was how he got into the band, but they needed a bass player, and he was able to hold his own.
Right.
But there are those pictures taken at the audition they did for Billy Fury in May of 1960, where he's got his back turned for a couple frames as they're auditioning. And then this myth grew that when they didn't get the gig, it was because John Lennon said to Larry Parnes, either you take all of us or none of us. It's all or nothing, because Larry Parnes says, no, that bass player's got to go. That never happened. That's nonsense. And they did end up backing Johnny Gentle. So it wasn't like they walked away empty-handed, or that Stewart was so terrible he was the deal breaker.
But it makes a better story.
It makes a better story, absolutely. And you've got, oh, look, here's a picture showing it.
Yeah.
Not that the
Yeah.
picture,
It's
maybe his
proof.
back is turned so he could face his amp and tune. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Alan
Well,
Williams, the type of guy you'd want to have a couple drinks with in a pub, you know.
and he would
you know?
happily drink them.
Yeah, yeah, that's yeah. But
Yeah.
now, Robert, the Revolver book, it actually, what I really have liked about it through the years. Matter of fact, I've bought 3 copies.
Oh, my.
Bunny's got one. I sent one to Bunny, and I gave another one away. And this is my latest one I bought not too long ago. But it really immerses you in that time frame. You
Then
know,
I've done my job, because that was what I thought. You know what? The Beatles didn't create a vacuum. This is the world they lived in. You too, reader, need to be there, which is why, as you were talking about before, the ads and magazines that are the illustrations in there, I wanted you to be, as a reader, in the world of 1966 to see what their world was like. Oh, this was the trade ad for this song, you know, Painted Black or whatever going on at that time. So I forget everything you know about what came after 1966 when you read this book.
Yes, very important. And well, you open up the book though, I think, now I'm going off memory, I haven't cracked it open today, but
The NME concert.
yeah, the NME, the Poll Winners concert. Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that's the album was almost complete, or was it complete by that time?
Well, they started in April and ended it in June, and that was May 1st.
That was in May. Okay.
So at about the
Yeah.
midway point. They would hear Pet Sounds about 2 weeks later when Bruce Johnson brought it to England. But it's sort of this nice little nexus of old Beatles and new
Yes.
Beatles.
Yes.
So new Beatles represented by what they're doing in the studio at that time. Old Beatles by, once again, we're doing the Anime Poll Winner show, which we did in 63, 64, 65.
Same old set, you know, it's
Right.
not, you know.
Yeah, and going through the motions. And it has this dramatic bit where Brian Epstein is having this argument with the producers of the show, which ultimately leads to, you know, one of these moments you wish you could have a time machine and go back. Their last live set on a stage in England was not filmed.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Craig, the argument was, correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, I think the argument was like the Stones and the Beatles were there both in the poll as poll winners, and they were going, who goes first, who goes second? I mean, who's going to go last, who's going to go second to last, that kind of thing.
And what the actual point is that there was so much airtime allowed for this thing, and the way the concert was running, you know, traditionally the show closer should be the one who tops the poll, which was the Beatles.
Right.
However, if they did it that way, the show would be over by the time the Beatles took the stage in terms of the broadcast.
Oh, yeah.
And so the Stones would get the glory by coming on first. And so, you know, Brian was like, well, you put the Beatles on, so they're on the air, on TV.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're not going to let you film us at all. And that's what ended up happening.
Okay.
Yeah. So a stupid thing like that, you think, Jesus, this is 1966. They couldn't have figured it out. They
Right.
couldn't have filmed it and done it later or something. I mean, it's like unthinkable for, you know, the 21st century, but that's how it was.
You know,
And go ahead, Craig.
go
Sorry.
ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, you know, as I'm the novice Beatles guy here, but it's interesting to me that there are basically 2 Beatles bands. There's the studio band and there's the live band, and they are completely different from one another.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think that's another reason, in case you asked the question, why Revolver didn't get the attention at the time that it should have. It's because the old Beatles were still dominant.
Right.
They still look the same, matching suits. They're doing what they've done the last 3 years. You know, they go out on the road. They didn't make a film that year, but otherwise, you know, we put a single out, and we put an album out, and so it was business as usual. And so by that time, you know, a little bit of the bloom is going off the rose. It's like, okay, we've seen this. We're getting older. There's other bands coming along. It wasn't dramatic like when first Strawberry Fields Penny Lane came out. These unbelievably artsy videos come out accompanying them, and oh my God, they're not dressed the same. They got facial hair. John's wearing glasses. It was a completely different presentation. So you didn't have that obvious left-hand hard turn that we do with Revolver. If they'd done that, it probably would have gotten a lot more attention. But instead, it was just like, okay, oh, they're going on the road, and oh, they got a new record out too. Okay,
yeah, it's the same old type of thing. Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
even though the contents were very much not.
Sure.
Yeah, but that ties into what we were saying though. They were that stage, the performing Beatles, that four-headed monster directly influenced, was really active during Revolver, as we said, because they were all contributing to each other's songs, except for She Said, She Said.
Yeah. That's a whole different
Did we ever
story.
figure out why Paul left? Craig, during the song, she said, Paul got mad and left the studio. Did we ever figure out, Robert, what happened there? Has that ever
So this is the best that we know. And this first was public knowledge. I mean, I guess if you were paying attention in 1966 and your ears are open, and not only are you, well, where's Paul on this track in terms of like a vocal presence? You look on the credits on the back cover, you know, lead vocal and backing vocal, and it's John and George on that track, and that's exactly what you're hearing. And so the voices is the first thing that's obvious. It's like, oh, no Paul here. That's interesting. And I think the first public clue that there might have been a story to this was when Many Years From Now was published in the 90s, which was sort of a ostensible memoir of Paul's. It was kind of, you know, transcribed by Barry Miles, but Paul didn't want to put it out as like my autobiography, but it was pretty much an as told to, and it's his voice throughout. And it's on the subject of, well, I think there was only a couple times that I didn't play bass on a Beatles track. One was She Said, She Said. We had a fight in the studio, and I said, well, screw you, and stormed off. So there's Paul
admitting
explicitly citing that song, saying, I didn't play on it. I walked out. We had an argument. So I put that in the book. And right now, there's definitely, I would be remiss to say there's not some people like, well, he cut the bass first, then he left because this is what's on the tapes. To me, unless you've got, you know, a Ring video recorder going in EMI, you don't know who's touching that bass, but there's two guitars on it. We don't know. And I'm just saying is that the fact that Paul says it with great clarity in the 90s, is that too far away from it for you? Okay. Peter Jackson does get back, cleans up the flower pot conversation, which is the serendipitous, secretive recording he plants in a flower pot in the canteen. Days after George Harrison walked out, he bugs the table where they don't think they're being filmed or recorded. And the way he presents it and Get Back, it's just John and Paul talking to each other. You know, he leaves out of the film that, well, in fact, Yoko's there, Linda's there, Ringo's there, Neil and Mel were probably there too. But they're all chiming in on the conversation. But they get to talking about grievances and George's issues, and they get on the subject of arrangement of songs. And John is going on and on about how they felt intimidated by Paul because he's so strong-willed and so certain in his musical vision that even on their own songs, if Paul was telling them they need to play it a certain way, they'd be cowed by it and go along, even though it dissatisfied them as the composers of the song. And you know, that's certainly an issue that comes up over and over again, is his being so strong-willed,
assertive, I think.
Yeah, you know, it's one thing if you wrote the song, and George, I don't want those echoing guitar lines on Hey Jude, thank you very much. But it's like, if you didn't write the song and you're telling them what's what. So when I was writing the book, it was my good fortune. You know how it is when you're looking for something, you find something else you weren't even looking for. It's like, wow, this is cool. I happen to be independently researching the book, listening to the Nagras and hearing that. And it's like, what did he just say? And John says something, I'm paraphrasing here, along the lines of the only time I could get what I wanted on it as an arrangement on one of my own songs is if I gave it to George to play, inferring if I tell him what to play, he'll play. He's not going to give me an argument the way you will, Paul. To which Paul responds, she said, she said. So this is January 13th, 1969. It's not 1996. It's not 2000. It's not him. Maybe the memory being a little confused and muddled by something he read in the intervening years. This is both of them 2 years after She Said was tracked, both bringing it up. So to my mind, what that speaks to is, okay, now you could look at it as, well, Paul was the last one to take acid. Now, the one thing I will correct in my book now, because we didn't have the living witness step forward that did subsequent to that, and I can't remember what band he was in, some minor British invasion band. I can't remember which one it was, but he was with Paul when Paul took his first acid trip. And even though Paul described it as being Christmas time 1966, which would have been after Revolver, in fact, it was Christmas time 1965. And the reason this guy knows this is because he was on the tour package with the Beatles when they did their Christmas shows. So he you know, it could only have been that time. So there was the speculation, well, maybe because this is another one of John's acid songs, you know, the Peter Fonda line, I know what it's like to be dead, that they got to poking at him about, you're the one who hasn't tried acid yet, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then he got pissed and walked out. No, in fact, he had tried acid. So that couldn't be it.
Right.
But the fact that they bring this up in this argument, or not argument, this discussion about arrangements a couple years down the road, it had to have been the fact that Paul had an idea for where the song should go. John didn't want it and dug his heels in and said, George, you take it. And Paul's like, fine, and storms out. The other thing we know about that song is that, and I do write about this in the book, is that John was struggling, having spent himself early in the sessions with all the songs he had ready. Tomorrow Never Knows, freshly written. I think the next one of John's they tracked was I'm Only Sleeping, maybe. You'd have to look at the book. But Rain comes in there. Dr. Robert, Andrew Bird Can Sing. So all these John songs are getting tracked right away. And then he runs dry. And it's during that lull that George slips in a third song because they're still trying to get to their 14 tracks. And that's how he does it. While Paul, he's got, this album and the next one written already. But then George is the one that goes out to Weybridge, where John's got these home demos of the song that became She Said, She Said. It's originally called He Said, He Said. And that was one part of it. And I think the When I Was a Boy, Everything Was Right was a separate song. And it's George that sits with John, and his quote later on was, that was a real weld, meaning taking two separate things and putting them together and creating one whole so John could get another song onto the album. And it was the last song they recorded for the sessions, literally the only song on that album that they did in a single day. Everything else was do the basic track, rework that, come back, do some overdubs the next week, something like that. No, that song was done start to finish, all in the final day of the sessions, because 2 days later, they were off to West Germany to start playing the Axis leg of their 66 World Tour, going to Germany and then Japan.
Right. And you also address in the book why the American version is missing the John songs, because they were sent over for Yesterday and Today.
Right. And it makes sense when you look at when Capitol came calling and wanted 3 new songs to flesh that album out, despite the fact they're sitting on at least 3 non-album songs at that time. Paperback Writer and Rain, for one. I'm Down. They easily could have stuck those on there and not bothered Revolver. Although the question then becomes, would Capitol put out a 14-track Revolver in America?
Yeah.
Not likely.
No.
Right.
No.
So if you look, they had like 6 songs ready to go when Capitol came calling. And of them, there were the 3 that made it over. I'm Only Sleeping, Andrew Bird Can Sing, Dr. Robert. And they're the most basic guitar-driven songs that make sense to fit alongside stuff like Nowhere Man and Drive My Car that they already had slated for the album. But the other 3 were Taxman, which at that point, they may have already decided, well, that's going to be the opener. We got the Count Off, which echoes Please Please Me 3 years before. This is the new phase of our career, so we're going to echo that. Tomorrow Never Knows. That's never going to fit alongside Act Naturally.
No, it never will.
No. And I don't remember what the third one was, but it was something else that it might have been Love You Too. So none of that's going to work. So they picked the 3 that did. So that's what you got, bolstering Yesterday and Today, and the weirdest thing of all is that this is Capitol getting nervous because they haven't put out anything since Rubber Soul. Imagine that. This is
that was at Christmas,
Yeah, that was at Christmas. It's 5 months later. Got to give us something, guys. And then they put it out. They put it out in June, and then Revolver follows 2 months later.
Yeah.
2 months later. It's like,
in August.
Did you really think the bubble was going to burst by the end of 66 or something? They must have.
Now, I got to tell you, though, Craig, Robert, that growing up, the Revolver I had was the American version. I mean, I'm just of that age. So
Me too.
It doesn't, it's not as jarring. Now, have I listened to it lately? No. I've usually listened to the UK edition,
Sure.
I mean, but
is
that's
it
what
still weird to you to hear I'm Only Sleeping coming right after Eleanor Rigby?
It's not right. Yes. Yeah.
Guilty.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because what the Revolver did was it 11 tracks? I can't remember off the top of my head.
That seemed to be Capitol's practice. I think the only time they didn't do that was Meet the Beatles.
Yeah. That was a complete amalgamation. Yeah. Anyway, Robert, thank you. I want to do a second part, but the book, The Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll, it is available at all your friendly neighborhood bookstores and also on Amazon, of course. Robert, any other avenues where we could people get in touch with the book?
No, that's just usual book places, and like I said, there's an audio version I didn't know about apparently out there. So all you blind people, you got the place to go. I would add this note as we're on the fast approach of the October coming of the Revolver box set. And I've been reading the Giles interviews and the stuff coming along. I wasn't there. I don't know. And pending further information, but you wanted to know, is there something coming along that's revelatory that changes things? So far, the only thing I know that's in my book that could be updated is Paul took his acid trip earlier than we thought. And that's only because a witness finally came out to say that. But one of the early buzzes I'm seeing is about this John Lennon demo of Yellow Submarine.
Yes.
Which presupposes he had more of a hand in the writing of that song than we knew to this point. We knew it was Paul that dreamed up that lick of I want to hear kids singing "We All Live in a Yellow Submarine," and that came from him. We've also known that Donovan contributed to the lyrics, which is part of their egalitarian spirit at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But to this point, we hadn't known anything, and John never laid claim to anything about Yellow Submarine, any authorship or like, oh yeah, it was mine or anything like that. Or I don't think anything beyond I helped with the lyrics. Well, so did Donovan. So he never expanded his role. And now I'm seeing Giles talking about this as if now we know actually John wrote it, and there's this sort of the Lennono effort to seed the internet with all this pro John stuff and all these Yoda-like quotes that he never actually said that are out there. It's like one more thing that I think audiences have been preconditioned that if anything is cool or amazing, of course John did it.
Right.
So they're going to want to embrace this, whether it's true or not. I say, pending further investigation, hold your horses. Let's see what there is to this before we start rewriting history all over again.
Sure.
Now, reportedly, though, you guys, that Lennon said from an interview, I believe in 68 or 69, that it's actually came out, and this is on the Hoffman forums, they were talking about it. Take that for what it's worth.
Sure.
But there's an interview with John where he does come and say, yeah, this is part of the song was a part of mine. I came in with it, and then Paul and I really wrote it together. Now,
that's interesting. If it's John saying it back then, I'd give it a lot more credit than anything he said post Klein, because this is John to his dying day saying he wrote 75% of the lyrics of Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah,
which is validated by exactly no one.
That's Klein going, yeah, friend. John, that's what you did. Yeah, you did it all, John.
Totally. I mean, he knew the key to John Lennon was flattery.
Yeah.
It's like, I know you wrote that. I know you wrote keeping her face in a jar by the door, because it sounds like something John might say, right? Except then you get Paul's explanation. My mother had Noxema cold cream that before she went out into the world would do her face, and that was what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Like, okay. My grandmother used Noxema too, so it rings through me.
And oh well, that's another episode we'll have to talk about. Is Alan Craigie? This guy was so. I mean, like their first meeting, and get back. John says, "Oh, I've got to go meet this guy. I don't really want to, but I better go." Yada yada yada. But what did Alan do? Oh, hi, John. Nice to meet you, Yoko. I couldn't wait to talk to you.
Oh yeah, he knew his audience.
Yes, totally. Craig, have you seen the Ruddles?
Yes.
So Belushi, Ron Klein.
Yes.
To a T. That's your Alan Clark.
Yeah. Yes. But
everything
anyway, Robert, thank you for hanging out with us. We could talk for hours. I do appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Everybody, be sure to check out Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll, available at your friendly neighborhood bookseller, and also Robert's Something About the Beatles podcast, award-winning podcast, fascinating. I can't live without it. Also, now you do another thing on YouTube, like Sat But Raw, Robert?
Yes. Yeah, that's it's the show minus the music clips, just so YouTube come to find got some rules about what you can use. So you want to hear just the interview segments, that's where that goes as well.
And Robert, one more question for you. Which edition are you on? How much are you in for Revolver paying to the Fabs as part of our obsessive compulsive contract?
I will defer the vinyl for now. I really want to see the book. That's the thing that's fascinating to me. It's like, okay, I know about the outtakes you guys are digging up and stuff like that. That'll be cool. Can't wait to hear that. The remixes, I've seen this movie.
But it's interesting. Yeah.
But if they've got new information, I'm all about information. That's what I want to see.
Yeah. I'm in for the vinyl. I'm in for 100. I found it for like $160. So I'm in for the vinyl.
Okay.
Don't tell my wife.
Right. And how many copies you buying?
Well, actually, a friend of mine, Bunny, and he's buying the CDs, and then he's gonna burn them for me, and then that way I'll have the CD so I can practice along with that stuff. Practice the drums. I don't know if you do that or not, but
There you go.
no. All right, Robert. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
so
Thank
much.
you. Craig,
Thank you,
thanks for
guys.
being here. And
Love talking to you guys
yeah,
anytime.
we'll stay in touch and take care.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.